and had already established a beachhead within the city when the news came that a massive Roman army was approaching. Unfortunately, we don't really have any idea just how big this army was, nor do we have any real idea how big Attila's army was. And it really doesn't help that all we have to go on are insanely inflated reports like Attila was leading an army 500,000 strong. Most of what I've read puts the opposing side somewhere between 50 and 75,000 men apiece, which sounds much closer to the truth, and which still makes the coming showdown one of the largest battles in late antiquity. The forces arrayed at the Battle of Adrianople, for example, were at most 25 to 30,000 a side, with the minimum thought to be maybe just 15,000 apiece. So, while we are not about to see 1,000,000 men squaring off against each other in battle, we are talking about maybe 100 to 150,000, which is pretty enormous, especially given the age. Caught in the middle of a siege operation, Attila decided to withdraw and regroup, rather than immediately turn to fight Aetius. The Roman Confederation trailed the Huns east for an indeterminate number of days, until Attila landed on a spot he thought would be favorable ground for a battle, the Catalaunian Fields. Though the site of the battle has never been firmly identified, it was somewhere in the Champagne-Ardenne region. The two armies lined up in late June and proceeded to launch a full-scale assault on one another, with no quarter asked or given. The details of the battle are just as confusing about every other detail of the Hun invasion of 451. Our principal source for all this is a 6th century Byzantine historian named Jordanus, who was, by his own admission, summarizing the work of an earlier 6th century Italian historian named Cassiodorus. So, no one anywhere near the actual battle itself. Jordanus says that, quote, "The battlefield was a plain, rising by a sharp slope, which both armies sought to gain. The Huns with their forces seized the right side, the Romans, Visigoths, and their allies on the left. The battle line of the Huns was so arranged that Attila and his bravest followers were in the center." He then goes on to describe how this ridgeline became the center of the fighting. Except, I'm kind of having a hard time picturing it. Was the ridgeline in between the two armies, running parallel to their front lines, or was it off to one side, running perpendicular, so that only a wing of each side was involved in the fighting to take the high ground? And frankly, left and right of what? Can a brother get some cardinal points? If anyone can help straighten this out for me, it would be very much appreciated. I've got another map up that looks like the elusive ridgeline was off to one side, but I don't really know, and frankly, I'm not sure Jordanus does either. Anyway, the story then goes that the Roman Goth forces reached the high ground first, and managed to repel all Hun attempts to take it. The Goths, who were working on the right, then managed to break through and send the Hun left into an unexpected retreat. As great as this punch-through was, though, it came at a heavy price to the Goths, as Theodoric was killed in the midst of the final push. The loss of the king was a small price to pay. The Huns had tasted defeat and were now on the run. The Roman, Goth, et al. Confederation had beaten the invincible Huns. But while this victory was sweet, it was not decisive. The Huns had pulled back, but they were not broken. Sure, Attila was pretty despondent that night in the fortified Hun camp, going so far as to begin construction of his own funeral pyre out of shame, until his captains pointed out that the Hun army was still mostly intact, their losses manageable, and the Romans only marginally better off. The Battle of the Catalaunian Fields was a setback, but it wasn't the end of anything. So buck up, Attila. There you go. Why don't you have some nice blood wine? We have some 2309, best in the Empire. Attila was fully recovered by the next day, and as his captains But that said, the aura of Hun invincibility had definitely been shattered, both among the Romans and the Huns themselves. For the next few days, the two armies stared each other down and waited for the other to make a move. Finally, Attila decided that it just wasn't worth it. His supply lines were drawn out like crazy. Feeding his people was a major concern, and with Aetius riding high and breathing down his neck, the Huns weren't going to be able to scatter and forage the way they needed to keep up the campaign. So Attila began a slow retreat out of Gaul. As soon as the Huns began to move east, the ties that had bound Aetius's confederation began to fray. The Goths were now minus one king, and Theodoric's son Thorismund asked Aetius if his people could return to their homes and settle the question of succession. Aetius was of course nervous about such a huge chunk of his army breaking off, but I've also seen it hinted that he actively encouraged Thorismund to head home, because that way Aetius wouldn't have to share the extensive spoils captured from the Huns. Though the Roman army was now far weaker, the Huns made no move to retake the offensive. And for his part, Aetius was not crazy enough to make any move that might rile up the Huns as long as they kept moving east. The retreat was not a pretty one for the people inhabiting the lands Attila passed through, but there was little Aetius could do about that. And even if he could have, he might still have been fine with the Huns blowing off some steam. After all, he had to keep his eye on the ball. The Huns were leaving. Don't screw that up. Because if you had presented this scenario to Aetius just a month before, that is, the Huns retreating and the Roman army still in one piece, he likely would have scoffed at your pie-in-the-sky fantasizing. So though it was a slow and destructive retreat the Huns were engaged in, it was a retreat, and Aetius wasn't going to risk the big-picture victory by trying to hurry Attila along. I don't know how long the withdrawal ultimately took, but I imagine the Huns were back across the Rhine by early fall, and back on the Hungarian plain by winter. I also imagine Attila spent that winter brooding and brooding and brooding. By the spring of 452, Attila had pretty well worked himself up into a vengeful fury, and was more than ready to go show the West just how not defeated the Huns really were. But this time, rather than swinging into Gaul, Attila drove straight for the heart of the Western Empire. The Huns crossed the Alps and poured unchecked into the Po Valley, ready for some serious ravaging. The first city they hit, of course, was Aquileia, which had so often repulsed the would-be ravagers of Italy. But as we've discussed, the Huns are different. The fortifications of Aquileia were crushed, and the Huns broke into the city in short order. Not content with simply sacking Aquileia, the Huns proceeded to smash and smash and burn and smash until the city was reduced to its foundations. Really, to the point where the great fortified city was a practically unrecognizable pile of rubble. Though another city named Aquileia would eventually grow up on the site of the old city, for all intents and purposes, the Aquileia we've been talking about for the last few hundred years, as the focal point of so many invasions and defenses of Italy, is gone. An interesting upshot of this destruction, though, was that the inhabitants of the city fled into the marshes of the coastline, leading some scholars to reckon that a good chunk of them wound up forming a community on some islands in a lagoon, establishing the core of the modern city of Venice. The destruction of Aquileia sent shockwaves through the empire, and put the fear of God into Valentinian III. Suddenly, the swamp surrounding Ravenna no longer seemed so impenetrable. So the emperor and his court packed their bags as quickly as they could and fled south to Rome. The Aurelian walls were still a thing to behold. Maybe they would prove to be as effective as the Theodosian walls had been, protecting Constantinople. Valentinian could only hope and pray, because it didn't look like there was much else that was going to stop the Huns. With Attila on the loose in Italy, Aetius was unable to raise the same sort of sense of camaraderie with the barbarian nations of Gaul as he'd been able to the year before when their homes were directly threatened. And so, all he had at his disposal this time were the ultimately inadequate regular Roman forces. Next week, Aetius will do his best to harass the Huns, as Attila marched from one conquest to the next in northern Italy. But though he was reduced to essentially waging a guerrilla campaign against Attila's supply lines, Aetius proved himself no less capable than when he was leading mighty armies in set-piece battles. And though it was almost certainly a combination of supply issues, disease, and bribery that finally led to Attila's withdrawal from Italy, I would hate to draw the ire of the Catholic High Command by not pointing most especially to the embassy of Pope Leo the Great, who single-handedly convinced the Huns to spare Rome and withdraw from the peninsula. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/. Qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 30-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go back to basics and re-recommend the classics, just in case anyone is still holding out. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. It's only like 120 hours long. That's nothing. So just go get it. And remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 173, The Broken Bow. After laying waste to Aquileia in the spring of 452, Attila and the Huns moved west across northern Italy, sacking every settlement they passed along the way. Though the imperial capital had moved to Ravenna 40 years earlier, the city of Milan remained the richest, largest, and most powerful city in the region, and that's exactly where Attila was headed. Aetius, and what forces he was able to muster, gamely tried to harass, hinder, and trip up the Hun advance, but there was only so much they could do. Though they made Attila's life difficult, and in time the constant harassment would wear the Huns down, but it was not enough to stop the Huns from reaching Milan. The former capital's defenses were impressive, but once again insufficient to hold off Attila. The only feather in the city's cap was that it held out long enough for the siege to become called a protracted siege. But in due time the Huns once again prevailed, and Milan was sacked. Down in Rome, Valentinian and his exiled court could do little more than tremble behind the Aurelian walls.